2 women, 1 throne room, and a man who could have any woman in the empire, but only one could be at his side when it mattered most. Before Hürrem Sultan became the most powerful woman in Ottoman history, she had to destroy another woman first. Her name was Mahidevran, the first favorite, the mother of the firstborn son, the woman everyone assumed would rule beside Suleiman the Magnificent for the rest of his life. Instead, history remembers her as the woman who lost everything to a red-haired slave girl from Ukraine. This is the real story behind the rivalry that magnificent century turned into television legend. The jealousy, the fights, the slapping scandal recorded by foreign ambassadors, and the devastating political war that ended with one woman ruling an empire, and the other exiled with nothing but her son's memory. 2 women, 1 palace, and a rivalry so fierce it reshaped the future of the Ottoman Empire forever. Before Hürrem ever set foot in the palace, Mahidevran Sultan was already the undisputed favorite of the young Suleiman. Believed to be of Circassian or Albanian origin, Mahidevran entered the harem as a slave concubine and quickly rose to become Suleiman's first serious companion, years before he ascended to the throne. In 1515, she gave birth to Şehzade Mustafa, Suleiman's first son, and for years, his only son, instantly elevating her status to Haseki, the Sultan's most favored consort. In the traditional Ottoman system, this position was everything. A concubine who bore the firstborn son wasn't just a favorite. She was the presumptive mother of the next sultan, a woman whose future power and protection were, by the old rules, essentially guaranteed. Mahidevran spent over a decade as Suleiman's primary companion, accompanying him through his early reign, watching their son grow into a young man widely admired at court for his intelligence and charm. By every traditional expectation of Ottoman succession, Mahidevran's path to becoming the empire's most powerful woman seemed secure. Then everything changed. Sometime around 1520, a new slave girl arrived in the Ottoman Harem, captured, according to most historical accounts, from the region of modern-day Ukraine, then part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Her name was Alexandra, or possibly Anastasia, though history would come to know her by her Ottoman name, Hürrem, meaning the cheerful one, a name that would prove almost ironic, given the fierce political battles she would soon wage. From the very beginning, contemporary accounts describe Hürrem as strikingly different from the palace's other women, witty, playful, musically talented, and possessing a magnetic charm that quickly caught Suleiman's attention, despite Mahidevran's established position. Unlike the more traditional, formal relationship many sultans maintained with their consorts, Suleiman and Hürrem reportedly developed something resembling genuine friendship and affection. She made him laugh, engaged him in conversation as an equal, and displayed an intelligence and boldness rarely seen in a concubine of her rank. Within a remarkably short time, the palace's newest arrival was no longer just another face in the harem. She was a serious threat to everything Mahidevran had spent over a decade building. Of all the stories surrounding this rivalry, none is more famous, or more debated by historians, than the alleged physical confrontation between Mahidevran and Hürrem. According to accounts recorded decades later, tensions between the 2 women erupted into an actual physical altercation, with Mahidevran reportedly attacking Hürrem, scratching her face and pulling her hair in a fit of jealous rage after Hürrem's growing influence became impossible to ignore. Some versions of the story claim Suleiman himself witnessed the aftermath, seeing visible marks on Hürrem's face and reacting with fury toward Mahidevran for daring to harm a woman he had grown genuinely attached to. While historians debate exactly how much of this dramatic confrontation is verified, fact versus later palace legend, much of it comes from accounts written after Hürrem's own rise to power, potentially shaped to justify her subsequent actions. The story became one of the most iconic moments in Ottoman popular history, dramatized unforgettably in magnificent century. Whether the slap happened exactly as described or not, it perfectly captures the raw, desperate intensity of 2 women fighting for the same man's favor, with an empire's future hanging in the balance. Following the alleged confrontation, Suleiman faced a decision that would ripple through Ottoman history for generations. By tradition, a sultan's relationship with the mother of his firstborn son was expected to remain the primary, most respected bond in the harem. But Suleiman's attachment to Hürrem had grown into something far beyond typical harem politics. Historians widely agree that whatever existed between them carried genuine emotional intensity. unusual for a relationship built within such a rigidly political system. Rather than punishing Hürrem or reinforcing Mahidevran's traditional status, Suleiman began spending increasing time with Hürrem, elevating her position at court, despite Mahidevran's seniority and her son's status as heir apparent. This decision alone sent shockwaves through the palace hierarchy, signaling to everyone watching that the old rules governing harem power might no longer fully apply. For Mahidevran, it must have felt like watching a decade of carefully built security dissolve in real time, replaced by a woman who had arrived at court only recently, but was rapidly rewriting every expectation about how Ottoman succession politics were supposed to work. What made Hürrem's rise so extraordinary wasn't just Suleiman's affection. It was how completely she shattered centuries of Ottoman harem tradition along the way. Under the empire's long-standing customs, a concubine typically bore only one son for the sultan before being sent away to raise him separately, specifically to prevent any single woman from accumulating too much influence at court. Hürrem broke this rule entirely, going on to bear Suleiman multiple children, including several sons, an almost unprecedented development that dramatically strengthened her political position with each birth. Even more shocking to palace observers, Suleiman eventually did something no reigning sultan had done in generations. He formally freed Hürrem from slavery and married her in a legal, recognized union, elevating her from concubine to legitimate wife. Foreign ambassadors stationed in Istanbul reported on this development with genuine astonishment, recognizing it as a complete departure from every expectation about how Ottoman sultans were supposed to relate to the women of their harem. For Mahidevran, watching from her increasingly marginalized position, each of these unprecedented moves must have felt like another door closing on any hope of reclaiming her former status. As Hürrem's influence grew, Mahidevran's position eroded in a slower, quieter, but equally devastating way. Rather than being dramatically exiled all at once, historical records suggest Mahidevran was gradually pushed to the margins of palace life, losing access to Suleiman's attention, resources, and the political relevance that had once made her the most important woman in the harem. Eventually, following Ottoman tradition for the mothers of princes, who were not expected to inherit the main line of succession immediately, Mahidevran was sent away from Istanbul to live with her son Mustafa, as he took up provincial governorship, a customary arrangement for princes gaining administrative experience, but one that, in her case, also conveniently removed her as a rival presence from Hürrem's growing sphere of influence at court. This departure marked the effective end of Mahidevran's role as a major political figure in Constantinople, transforming her from the empire's presumed future power center into a distant, increasingly isolated mother whose entire remaining political relevance depended entirely on her son's uncertain future. With Mahidevran gone from the political center of the empire, Hürrem's ascent accelerated dramatically. She earned the formal title of Haseki Sultan, an honor historians believe may have even been created specifically to reflect her unprecedented status as both legal wife and primary political partner to the Sultan, a title that would later be used for the most powerful consorts throughout the rest of Ottoman history. Beyond her personal relationship with Suleiman, Hürrem became directly involved in matters of state, reportedly advising Suleiman on political decisions, corresponding directly with foreign rulers including the King of Poland, and commissioning major architectural and charitable projects across the empire, including mosques, soup kitchens, and hospitals bearing her name. This level of formal political involvement was extraordinary for any Ottoman consort, let alone one who had arrived in the palace as a captured slave girl with no noble lineage. Hürrem wasn't simply the Sultan's favorite anymore. She had become a genuine political institution in her own right, wielding influence that stretched from the harem's private chambers to the empire's foreign policy decisions. As both women's sons grew into young men, the personal rivalry between their mothers evolved into something far more consequential, a genuine succession crisis. Mustafa, Mahidevran's son, was widely regarded throughout the empire, and even by foreign ambassadors, as intelligent, capable, and enormously popular among the military and general public, seen by many as the natural, deserving heir to Suleiman's throne. Hürrem's sons, meanwhile, particularly Şehzade Selim and Şehzade Bayezid, represented her own family's competing claim to the succession, a claim that directly threatened Mustafa's otherwise seemingly secure path to power. This wasn't simply a matter of maternal pride anymore. In the brutal reality of Ottoman succession politics, only one prince could ultimately become sultan, and the others faced the historical precedent of execution to prevent future civil war. Every political move Hürrem made on behalf of her own sons was, by direct extension, a move against Mustafa's future, meaning the rivalry that began with two jealous women competing for one man's affection had transformed into a genuinely dangerous struggle over the fate of an empire, with real lives now hanging in the balance. Hürrem's rise didn't just threaten Mahidevran. It eventually reshaped the entire balance of power at court, including the fate of Suleiman's closest friend and Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha. Once considered the second most powerful man in the empire and a close personal ally of Suleiman since childhood, Ibrahim Pasha had reportedly formed a political alliance with Mahidevran's faction, supporting Mustafa's path to succession. As Hürrem's influence expanded, tensions between her circle and Ibrahim Pasha's grew increasingly dangerous, with some historians suggesting Hürrem played a direct role in undermining Suleiman's trust in his old friend over time. In 1536, in a shocking turn that stunned the entire empire, Ibrahim Pasha was executed by strangulation on Suleiman's orders, his enormous wealth and property seized by the crown. While historians continue debating exactly how much influence Hürrem personally exercised in this dramatic downfall, the timing and political alignment made the connection impossible for contemporary observers to ignore. Another sign that the rivalry originally sparked between two women in the harem had grown into a political force capable of reshaping the empire's entire power structure. The rivalry that began between two women in the harem reached its most devastating conclusion in 1553. By this point, Mustafa had grown into a widely respected military commander, deeply popular with the Janissary soldiers, and increasingly viewed by many at court as the empire's natural future leader. This popularity, ironically, became his greatest danger. Convinced through court intrigue, which many historians believe Hürrem and her son-in-law Rustam Pasha actively encouraged, that Mustafa was plotting to seize the throne prematurely, an aging and increasingly suspicious Suleiman summoned his own son to his military camp. There, according to widely accepted historical accounts, Mustafa was executed by strangulation on his father's direct orders, a devastating end for the prince once considered the empire's most promising future ruler. The execution shocked the empire and reportedly caused significant unrest among the Janissary soldiers who had admired him. For Mahidevran, it represented the final, catastrophic culmination of a rivalry that had begun decades earlier, with jealousy and hair-pulling in a palace chamber, ending instead with the death of the son she had spent her entire life protecting and preparing for power. Contemporary accounts describe Mahidevran's grief following her son's execution as profound and unrelenting, the final devastating chapter in a rivalry that had cost her everything she once held. Stripped of her status, her influence, and now her only child, Mahidevran spent her remaining years living a quiet, largely forgotten existence, far from the political center she had once expected to command. Some historical accounts suggest she eventually settled in Bursa, an early Ottoman capital with strong ties to royal mourning traditions, living out her final decades in relative obscurity, compared to the extraordinary power and visibility Hürrem continued to enjoy in Istanbul until her own death in 1558. The contrast between the two women's final years could hardly be more striking, one continuing to shape imperial policy, architecture, and diplomacy from the heart of the empire, the other quietly mourning in the shadow of a rivalry she had ultimately lost decades earlier, when a red-haired girl first arrived through the palace gates and changed the course of Ottoman history forever. For millions of international viewers, this entire rivalry first became known through the hit Turkish television series Magnificent Century, which dramatized the relationship between Mahidevran, Hürrem, and Suleiman for a global audience spanning dozens of countries. In many respects, the show captured genuine emotional truths about this historical rivalry: the devastating power shift from tradition to passion, the real political stakes behind personal jealousy, and the tragic inevitability of Mustafa's fate given the empire's brutal succession customs. The core historical framework, Mahidevran's initial status, Hürrem's unprecedented rise, and the eventual execution of Mustafa, closely follows documented Ottoman history, giving the show a genuine foundation despite its dramatic embellishments. This is part of why the series resonated so powerfully with international audiences. Underneath the costumes and dramatic dialogue lies a genuinely remarkable, well-documented historical story that needed surprisingly little invention to feel like the most compelling palace drama imaginable. Despite its strong historical foundation, Magnificent Century, like any dramatized adaptation, took significant creative liberties for the sake of compelling television. Many specific conversations, secondary conspiracies, and detailed personal interactions between characters shown in the series simply aren't documented in surviving historical records, since harem life was, by design, extremely private and poorly recorded by outside observers. The show also compressed and dramatized timelines for narrative pacing, and gave certain characters, including Mahidevran herself, more prolonged direct confrontations with Hürrem throughout the series than historical sources can actually confirm occurred over such an extended period. Additionally, the sheer number of elaborate, ever-changing costumes and jewelry displayed throughout the series, while visually stunning, reflects modern television production values rather than strict historical accuracy regarding harem clothing and daily palace life. None of this diminishes the show's cultural impact or its success at introducing global audiences to genuine Ottoman history, but it's worth understanding where captivating television storytelling and verified historical record actually diverge. One of the most interesting reconsiderations among modern historians involves Mahidevran's portrayal throughout this entire story. For centuries, popular retellings, including much of Magnificent Century, cast Mahidevran primarily as the bitter, jealous rival standing in the way of Hürrem's inevitable rise. But viewed through a different lens, Mahidevran was simply a woman who had followed every rule of the system she was born into, achieving exactly the status that system promised her, only to watch an unprecedented set of circumstances completely rewrite those rules without her consent. Her anger, her alleged physical confrontation with Hürrem, and her fierce protectiveness over Mustafa's succession claim can all be understood not as villainy, but as a woman fighting desperately to protect the future she had been promised and had spent over a decade building for herself and her son. From this perspective, the real story isn't a simple battle between a villain and a heroine. It's a genuinely tragic collision between two women, each doing everything in her power to survive and protect her children within one of history's most ruthless political systems. Whatever judgment history ultimately passes on the methods she used to secure it, Hürrem's legacy as one of the most influential women in Ottoman, and arguably world, history remains undeniable. She permanently transformed the role of the Haseki Sultan, established a precedent for direct political involvement by imperial consorts that would echo through the following century, commissioned lasting architectural works still standing in Istanbul today, and successfully ensured that her own bloodline, through her son Selim II, continued the Ottoman dynasty for generations to come. Her extraordinary journey from captured slave girl to arguably the most powerful woman in the empire's history remains one of the most remarkable individual transformations in Ottoman history, achieved through a combination of genuine emotional connection, political intelligence, and a willingness to break centuries of tradition that had never before been successfully challenged by any woman in her position. Today, Hürrem Sultan is one of the most recognized figures in all of Ottoman history, her tomb standing prominently beside Suleiman's own magnificent mausoleum at the Süleymaniye Mosque complex in Istanbul, a final physical testament to just how completely she succeeded in cementing her place at the center of imperial memory. Mahidevran, by contrast, remains a far more obscure figure outside of academic and enthusiast circles, her story largely overshadowed by the woman who ultimately outmaneuvered her for Suleiman's favor and the empire's future. This striking asymmetry in how history remembers these two women reflects the simple, brutal reality of Ottoman court politics. Victors wrote, and were remembered by, history, while those who lost the game, regardless of how legitimate or sympathetic their position had once been, often faded quietly into historical footnotes, remembered mainly through the story of the woman who defeated them. Nearly 500 years later, the rivalry between Mahidevran and Hürrem continues to captivate global audiences, and it's not difficult to understand why. At its heart, this is a deeply human story of love, jealousy, ambition, and survival, themes that transcend any specific historical period or culture. It's a story about what happens when the established rules of power suddenly change, about a mother's desperate fight to protect her child's future, and about how far genuine connection between two people can overturn even the most rigid, centuries-old traditions. Add in genuine political stakes affecting one of history's largest empires, real executions, real power struggles, and a documented historical foundation, solid enough to support even the most dramatic television adaptation, and it becomes clear why this particular harem rivalry has achieved a level of lasting global fascination that few other historical stories can match. The Mahidevran-Hürrem rivalry wasn't an isolated event. It established a template for harem political competition that would repeat throughout the following centuries of Ottoman history. Later rivalries, including the famous conflict between Nurbanu and Haseki Sultan decades afterward, followed strikingly similar patterns. Established favorites threatened by rising newcomers, sons whose fates became inseparable from their mother's political standing, and power struggles that blurred the line between personal jealousy and genuine imperial politics. Understanding the Mahidevran-Hürrem rivalry, then, isn't just about understanding one dramatic moment in the 16th century. It's about understanding the underlying structural forces that shaped harem politics for the rest of the empire's history, where a woman's personal relationships and her political survival were permanently, inescapably intertwined in ways almost impossible to fully separate from each other. In the end, the rivalry between Mahidevran and Hürrem was never really about two jealous women fighting over one man. It was about the future of an empire, decided through love, loss, ambition, and devastating sacrifice. One woman rose from slavery to become one of history's most powerful consorts, permanently reshaping the role of women in Ottoman politics. The other lost everything the traditional system had once promised her, including, ultimately, her own son. Both paid an extraordinary price for their place in this story. If you loved this deep dive into the real history behind Magnificent Century, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories from inside the Ottoman Empire's most dramatic corridors of power. And let us know in the comments, whose side are you really on, Mahidevran or Hürrem? See you in the next video.